this week's report, we investigate what happened to wild salmon populations in British Columbia, Canada, as DFO, or Fisheries and Oceans Canada, is presiding over some of the lowest wild Pacific salmon runs in Canadian history. In this report, we focus on the suspension of MSC certification for Sockeyes, pinks, and chums. We exhibit the management or mismanagement of the fisheries of DFO, and we disclose the facts on how open net pen farmed salmon on the West Coast are affecting wild salmon stocks. Please note that we do recognize there are a number of other factors affecting wild salmon populations, such as predation and climate change, ocean migration, etc. However, we just could not fit everything into one episode, so please keep tuned in for further updates. On October 4th, 2019, the Canadian Pacific Sustainable Seafood Society's Christina Burridge announced its decision to self-suspend MSC certification for BC Sockeye, pink, and chum salmon effective November 27th, 2019. We reached out to Christina Burridge, who is the Executive Director of the BC Seafood Alliance, and asked her some tough questions. Was the self-suspension of MSC certification for BC chum, pink, and sockeye mainly the fault of DFO not being able to meet target conditions?
We self-suspended because we believed DFO could not demonstrate that the work had been done to show that we could meet the conditions where progress was behind schedule. The MSC assessment team has always been clear that the DFO does a decent job of managing BC salmon given the biological, geographical, cultural, and political complexities. It does not do a very good job of documenting its hard work, so we struggle to meet the requirements.
Should DFO ultimately be held accountable for what has happened to BC's wild salmon fisheries?
DFO's job is to manage no matter what happens to the resource. The assessment says it has done a decent job under changing environmental conditions and ever more complex political and cultural realities. For instance, the commercial harvest rate has dropped from 80% in the early 90s, when returns were strong, to about 20% or less today, a level which is unlikely to have much of an effect either way.
OceanWise hosted a great webinar summarizing key factors to the self-suspension of BC salmon, in which we have provided the transcription in our report below this video. When it comes to the research and science, there is no denying the fact that DFO biologists and scientists are doing great scientific work, but could the same be said for how BC fisheries are managed from over 4,000 kilometers away in Canada's capital city of Ottawa? We obtained this video with Canada's Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, the Honourable Bernadette Jordan, an NDP, NP, and member on the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, Gord Johns. That could shed some light on which process in which policies are made from across the country.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, again for being here today. Minister, yesterday we talked about the Cohen Commission, and you talked about that your government is moving on all of the recommendations of the Cohen Commission. Recommendation number 19 falls within this COVID window. It says on September 30th, 2020, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans should prohibit net pen salmon farming in the Discovery Islands, Fish Health Zone, Subzone 3.2, unless he or she is satisfied that such farms pose at most a minimal risk of serious harm to the health of migrating Fraser River sockeye salmon. And the minister's decision should summarize the information relied on and include detailed reasons. The decision should be published on the Department of Fisheries and Oceans website. There's sea louse, 6 sea louse found on the average migrating salmon right now. So I'm concerned, Minister, what decision are you going to be making, and will you be following through with this recommendation on the date of September 30th?
Can I turn that one to the Deputy, please?
Yep, we're busy compiling risk assessments right now in order to support that particular announcement. We're not ready to make it yet, but that's certainly the date that we're working to.
Okay, it's 3.5 months out, so it's concerning the people, of course, of the Broughton. Also, in terms of the dual role, a campaign promise in 2015, the government said it would restore its role to protect wild salmon and no longer be the agent for the aquaculture industry. Can the minister comment on where the government's at on this promise that's 5 years old?
Thank you, Mr. Johns. As I said yesterday, I'm committed to working with the provinces and with Indigenous communities to move forward responsibly to transition open net pen farming on coastal British Columbia. A change like this requires cooperation. It requires consultation. Those are all things that we're working to do right now. And I mean, it's not something that's just going to happen overnight, but we are.
It's been 5 years, so that's longer than overnight. And Minister, can you comment back to Mr. Fass's question about sport fishers and recreation? They're waiting for some additional help. The rollout, the current government rollout, is not enough. They've asked for support, whether it's even marking fish, having some support on the salmon stamp. Will you honor any of the requests from the sports sector and make sure that they can get through the winter so that next year they can fish, and maybe extending EI for them like you are for the commercial fleet? Can you make sure that you're following through with them to support them in this difficult time?
A quick answer, please.
I'm sorry, but recreational fishers would not qualify for EI. EI is for commercial enterprises, not recreational. Agreed. However, the people who support the industry, people, for example, the guides, the people who work within the industry, they are eligible for things like the CERB. They're eligible for the business account.
They need more. They need extra help.
In an interesting turn of events, while we successfully had a preliminary Zoom call with Mr. Johns, where he genuinely seemed very excited to speak on wild salmon populations, we were then told to submit our questions for a secondary Zoom call. Since submitting the questions and multiple follow-up attempts, we received 0 response back from the office of Gord Johns. We are extremely disappointed in the lack of communication and participation on this matter. Now moving on to farm salmon and how a virus and sea lice affect wild salmon populations. PRV, or Piscine virus, is the causative agent of heart and skeletal muscle inflammation, or HSMI, present in nearly all open net farmed Atlantic salmon on Canada's west coast. Wild salmon interests and conservationists have long expressed concerns that PRV emanating from open net salmon farms could impact wild salmon passing by. A March 2019 study undertaken by scientists from the University of British Columbia and DFO's Pacific Biological Station concluded that they could not find significant harm to the fish's respiratory physiology despite the virus replicating to a load equal to, if not higher, than those seen naturally in wild or farmed fish. However, new research may be on the way as we reached out to famed DFO scientist Dr. Christy Miller-Saunders, best known for her discovery of a genomic signature in dwindling Fraser River sockeye salmon populations, but was then muzzled to speak on the research under the Stephen Harper government. Christy advised,
"From what is understood, PRV-caused diseases occur almost exclusively when water is cool, with marine diseases occurring in the first winter at sea. Although there have been also incidences of PRV disease in freshwater fry, again in cool months. There is growing evidence from my lab that PRV is capable of causing disease in Chinook salmon, again over their first winter at sea, and this virus does come up as contributing to lower population level survival when it is prevalent."
Sea lice are marine ectoparasites or external parasites that feed on the mucus, epidermal tissue, and blood of host marine fish. Migrating salmon pass open net fish farms set up along wild salmon migration routes infested with sea lice to which they attach themselves onto wild salmon. There are numerous published studies spanning over the last decade that conclude louse on juvenile salmon can drastically reduce their chances of survival. DFO have established guidelines for acceptable levels of sea lice in fish farms. However, self-reported data is showing that up to 35% of BC's farms have exceeded these levels. Results from a recent wild salmon study actually reported that 94% of wild salmon fry in the Discovery Islands has sea lice attached. We now present you with a newly released video of Alexandra's opening remarks in her testimony to the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans during their State of the Pacific Salmon sessions on August 11th. Alexandra Morton is an independent biologist who was granted an honorary doctorate of science by Simon Fraser University for her research on sea lice, which she began in 2001. She cites in one of her trials that almost 98% of juvenile pink salmon with a mature louse died.
For the moment, policy is keeping pace with emerging science on an emerging virus. However, this is not the case when it comes to salmon runs of national importance. If fishing was the dominant extinction driver for salmon runs, The fact that most salmon fisheries have been increasingly closed over the last few years would have caused the salmon runs to increase. As well, in one of the most heavily farmed regions of the coast, the Broughton Archipelago, wild salmon are declining in the unlogged and the logged watersheds. For some reason, the Canadian government is ignoring critical warnings that salmon farms are harming wild salmon runs. This is coming from the Auditor General's Office, Dr. Mona Niemer, the Chief Scientist of Canada, Stephen Harper's Cohen Commission, which recommended that salmon farms be prohibited from the Discovery Islands unless Minister Bernadette Jordan can demonstrate by September 30th of this year that the risk from the farms is minimal. However, this is just not going to be possible for her. Last fall, then Minister Jonathan Wilkinson announced that the 2019 sockeye return was the lowest in the history of this country. And yet, on March 1st of this year, DFO granted salmon farms permission to have an unlimited number of sea lice. Predictably, 99% of the young Fraser sockeye on the migration route were infected with sea lice levels that we know will reduce their survival. Wild salmon are simply not making it to sea past the salmon farms. On July 30th, the sockeye trying to go by Port Hardy were infected with an average of 42 lice per fish. These fish are 10 centimeters long, 42 lice. If this continues, there's nothing you can do that will boost their survival. You have to deal with the salmon farming issue. The sockeye infected with sea lice this year are the dominant cycle. This is the one the Fraser River nations and commercial fisheries depend on, and we will know the outcome of this infection in 2022. Then there's the situation with the virus PRV, Piscine orthoreovirus. One DFO lab says this virus is natural to British Columbia and it's low risk, don't worry about it. But another DFO lab is saying it's significant risk to Pacific salmon. Academic research is saying this is not natural to the BC coast, it's from the Atlantic. My research is saying this virus is spreading. And in 2018, Washington State prohibited PRV-infected farmed salmon because it was too big a risk to wild salmon. And as a result, the farms in Washington State are standing empty because there are no clean fish for that company to access, to put into those pens. But here in BC, the industry told the Federal Court of Canada that they would be significantly impacted if they were not allowed to farm with PRV-infected salmon. And so DFO policy has decided that the virus is natural and low risk. If you don't see scandal here, it's because you're not looking. Salmon farms are the greatest single impact on wild salmon since the glaciers. And this impact is entirely removable. The one place on this coast where sea lice are going down is the Broughton Archipelago, where First Nations have removed several million farmed Atlantic salmon. So here's my recommendations to you. Create a Pacific region director of wild salmon. We need somebody at a senior management level in DFO whose whole life is focusing on restoring wild salmon. And this must be done in partnership with First Nations. Mandate the removal of salmon farms from the ocean, beginning with the biggest migration routes. This will attract significant land-based investment because the infrastructure for this industry is already here. And please harness the remarkable science that is in DFO that can read the immune system of fish, allowing the fish to actually talk to us, to tell us where and how we are hurting them, and whether we are making that better or worse. And so the fish themselves will guide their own restoration. If Canada follows this path, truly meaningful reconciliation begins. We jump right into the fight against climate change by significantly increasing the annual growth in forests and every fishing country in the world will come to Canada to learn how we did this. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
When it comes to the management of BC's salmon fisheries, many people can be quoted saying that DFO is dropping the ball. However, rather than dropping the ball, perhaps DFO is trying to juggle too many balls and balance conflicting demands and jurisdictional issues while trying to develop and implement rational policy. They hear many messages from different stakeholders and even different messages from the same stakeholders. What are your thoughts on the state of Pacific salmon? We would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Thank you for joining me for the Tradex Foods 3-Minute Market Insight. This is Kyla Ganton, reminding you to stay safe, buy smart, and eat more seafood.